Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. My name is Erica Smith, and I'm a senior attorney at the Institute for Justice. Families need a choice in their children's education. They need to be able to choose where and how their child learns. Right now, most families do not have the financial means to make these choices. As a result, countless children struggle in their assigned public schools. And this is true even for kids attending good public schools. Education is not one size fits all, and just because a school works for one child doesn't mean it's going to work for another. Today, during the pandemic, more kids are struggling than ever as they're forced to learn virtually. So what's the solution? Educational choice programs. These programs are designed to give families money to pursue the education of their choice, whether that's private school, tutoring, online learning, or a combination of all the above. But while EdChoice programs exist in 29 states, we still have a long way to go. Most of these programs are still very modest, and 21 states don't have a program at all. We need more programs in more states, and these programs need to cover more kids. Fortunately, the outlook is good. There are two recent events that paved the way for more choice programs, and that's the Supreme Court's Espinoza decision issued last summer, and ironically, the pandemic itself. I'm going to talk about these events, how they affect choice, and what we need to do moving forward. First, let's talk about the Espinoza decision. Many of you have heard of this case, but you might not have a full understanding of its impact and what comes next. My firm, the Institute for Justice, represented the families in that case, and I was one of the lead attorneys. So let's get into it. Espinoza is a landmark decision that removed a big legal barrier to EdChoice programs. What Espinoza said was that the government cannot bar religious schools or religious options in a choice program. And that's true even if we're in a state that has a state constitution saying otherwise. This is so important because prior to the decision, the biggest legal barrier to EdChoice was state constitutional provisions called Blaine Amendments. Blaines exist in 37 state constitutions, and they say that the government cannot use public money to fund sectarian schools. As a result, choice opponents argued that Blaine Amendments made choice programs unconstitutional because they allowed families a choice of going to religious schools. So you may be thinking, well, that kind of makes sense, right? These amendments are just trying to protect separation of church and state. But no, that's not the case, and for two reasons. First, choice programs don't fund religious schools, they fund families. And if a family wants to choose a religious school, that's their choice, not the government's. In fact, while some families choose religious schools because they share their faith, other families choose religious schools for reasons having nothing to do with religion. Like maybe that school has superior academics, superior safety, discipline, the list goes on. And let me make a second point about this. Blaine Amendments were not designed to protect separation of church and state. They were actually intended to do the exact opposite. These provisions were originally enacted in the late 1800s when the public schools themselves were religious. They were Protestant, as were the rest of the country. But when Catholics started emigrating to this country, the Protestant majority passed Blaine Amendments to preserve the Protestant status quo and prevent the rise of Catholic schooling. In modern times, these amendments went even further and were used to limit all parental choice, not just Catholic choice. And that was exactly what was happening before Espinoza. Courts in 14 states had interpreted these amendments in a way to limit or bar choice programs. And even in states with good court precedent, legislators were still afraid to pass these programs because they didn't want to violate the Blaine. So Blaines were a big problem and the primary legal barrier to enacting choice. Happily, Espinoza went a long way toward removing that barrier. In a 5-4 decision, authored by Chief Justice Roberts, the Supreme Court said that these provisions can no longer be interpreted to exclude religious schools from choice programs. As the court said, a state need not subsidize private education, but once a state decides to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they are religious. Doing so discriminates against schools and the families that wish to attend them based on their religious status. And that's unconstitutional under the Clause, which protects religious liberty. When the Supreme Court released the Espinoza decision, Ed choice advocates celebrated. It was a champagne-worthy event. And 7 months later, we are already seeing the decision's impact. State legislators nationwide are working to use the decision to pass more choice programs. There are currently about 20 state legislatures that are considering a school choice bill. And at the Institute for Justice, we are submitting testimony every week to these legislators about how Espinoza makes their proposed program constitutional. We feel very hopeful more programs will pass this year and in the years to come. But the legal fight is not over. Espinoza does not guarantee that a program is constitutional, and there's 2 reasons for that. First, there are other provisions in state constitutions that bar or limit choice, and choice opponents are all the time finding new legal arguments to bring, no matter how obscure. Back in 2012, for example, the lead attorney for the National Education Association said that they would grab onto any Mickey Mouse provision they could find in state constitutions to try to bring down these programs. And they continue to try to do exactly that to this day. Fortunately, we have a very good track record protecting programs from these challenges. The second reason we need to keep fighting in court is because some choice opponents are trying to find loopholes in Espinoza. Remember that the Espinoza decision said that the government cannot discriminate against the religious status of schools or the families. But the court did not address a related issue, and that's whether the government can discriminate against the religious use of funds in a school choice program. So we're talking about the difference between religious status and religious use. And let me give you some examples of how this could play out. For example, the government could try to say, we're going to exclude this Catholic school from the program, but we're not excluding the school because it's Catholic. Instead, we're excluding it because it uses money on Catholic things like teaching religion, hiring religious teachers, and holding mass. Or the government say to a family, if you choose to go to a non-religious school, we'll give you a scholarship for the entire tuition. But if you choose to go to a Jewish school, we're only going to give you half the tuition. And that's because we determined that about half of that school's expenses are religious. So you only get half. So this sounds kind of silly, right? Like, of course, religious schools are using money for religious expenses. That's part of being school. But yet, these are the exact arguments some government officials are already making. In fact, we have cases on this exact issue that we're litigating right now in Vermont. Fortunately, there are already justices on the US Supreme Court who agree that there is no meaningful distinction between religious status and use, and that discriminating against either or both is unconstitutional. But the courts are going to have to hash this out, even if it means that we have to go all the way back to the US Supreme Court. But we feel very optimistic about it. In the meantime, we will keep fighting to pass more choice programs. And Espinoza makes it so much easier for us to do so. But as I'm sure you know, passing a choice program is not easy. And that's because there's not just legal barriers, there are policy barriers. Every time a program is passed, teachers' unions, or every time a program is proposed, we're not even getting into passing yet, teachers' unions send out their members in droves to oppose the bill. They don't want competition. Unfortunately, some legislators are afraid to stand up to the unions. And it's not just the unions that are opposing choice. In many places, it's also parents. The unions steer parents away from supporting choice by telling them it will hurt the public school. That's not true, and studies show it's not true, but it's an emotional argument that can be very effective in some places. In good news, though, public opinion seems to be shifting. And that's because of COVID-19. The pandemic has been brutal for our country, and hundreds of thousands of Americans have died, and even more have lost their jobs. But the pandemic is also bringing long-lasting cultural change, some of which might be positive. Everything from our sanitation practices and remote work to how we communicate with our friends and family. And COVID is changing something else too, and that's how families see public education and how they see education generally. This is true in 2 ways. First, parents by and large are not happy with how public schools have handled the pandemic. They're not happy with how they've handled the shutdowns and the virtual learning. Second, as children study remotely, parents are getting a glimpse inside the classrooms for the first time, and in many cases, they are not impressed. Every one of us knows a family who switched to private school during the pandemic, and there's been an even bigger shift to homeschooling. But not all parents can afford these options, so they find themselves supporting EdChoice. There's a third reason we see more support for school choice, and that's because the pandemic has led to parents being more involved in their children's education. Parents are experimenting with a combination of different learning techniques at home, whether they're just supplementing the public school curriculum or doing full-blown homeschooling. And many parents are finding that they actually like it. This has resulted in new interest in a certain type of EdChoice program called Education Savings Accounts, or ESAs. ESAs allow parents to customize their child's education. They do this by giving parents money in a bank account that they could use for any educational expense, not just private school tuition. They could pay for online learning, school books, tutors, or you name it, whatever you can think of. And it's really the next level of school choice. While only 5 ESA programs currently exist, they are the most popular program now being considered by legislatures. And we're very hopeful some of these programs will pass. Before I close, I just want to address one more COVID development that has legal implications for school choice. COVID has led to the rise of a new type of schooling called microschools. These are purely private enterprises. They're not usually government funded, at least not yet. But increasingly, government officials are trying to restrict and even eliminate these schools. This may be the next battle in the EdChoice movement. So what are microschools? Microschools typically refer to a group of parents pooling their money together to hire a tutor for a small group of kids. This concept has been around for decades, but it's really taken off during COVID because it allows families to minimize the COVID risk because the group is so small, while also allowing their children to learn in person with their peers instead of alone at home on computers. Because it's such a small group, the tutor can also tailor a curriculum specific to those children's needs and interests and experiment with different educational philosophies. Predictably, though, government is already getting in the way of this great idea. Some local and state officials argue that these little schools need to satisfy the same requirements as a full-blown private school. So we're talking about a mountain of paperwork, getting a business license, doing background checks, even coming up with fire escape plans, even if you're just learning in your living room. It's kind of ridiculous. It's lots of red tape getting in the way. We're also seeing arguments that these microschools need to abide by home daycare requirements, which can be extremely restrictive in some towns and cities. So microschools are just the latest example of the government limiting a new innovation because it doesn't fit within an existing regulatory framework. It's an evolving area of law, and we're keeping an eye on this. We're also brainstorming the best way to fight back. But we're confident that microschools and other innovative schooling methods will prevail. If they work, that should be all that matters. So to close up, EdChoice has a long road ahead of it, but there is plenty to be optimistic about. Every year, the number of kids benefiting from these programs goes up, and we expect that will keep happening in the years to come. One day, we believe every family will have a genuine choice in their child's education. Thank you.
Hi, and welcome to the School Choice Path Forward from Espinoza panel discussion. I'm Lori Armistead with the Walton Family Foundation. And I'm excited to moderate this panel today with our friends, Catherine Bathgate from State Policy Network and School Forward. She's coming to us from Utah. Erica Smith from the Institute for Justice, a senior attorney there, who helped co-lead the Espinoza case, and Jason Bedrick, who is coming to us from EdChoice in his home state of Arizona. Thanks everyone for joining. So we'd like to dig in on just kind of the high level question that is before us, which, as you all know, I think you likely just listened to Erica's talk about the Espinoza case. Thanks for doing that, Erica. But we'd like to just kind of kick it off on what the Espinoza ruling really was. I think there's a lot of potential misconceptions that all Blaine amendments were just kicked out of state record, or that private school choice is an easy policy solution now in every single state. So why don't you break it down for us quickly, Erica? And then also maybe just give us a brief overview, both of the decision and some proactive approaches that Institute for Justice and potentially others might be taking in the courts at this time related to education choice.
Sure, and thanks, Lori. So you're right that while Espinoza went a long way, it doesn't guarantee the legality of school choice programs. What Espinoza said was that you can't exclude religious schools from a school choice program based on their religious status. This is such a big deal because before Espinoza, so many states were interpreting their Blaine amendments to do exactly that, to exclude religious schools. And after Espinoza, they can no longer do that. But there are still other ways that choice programs may get in trouble. For example, there's other state constitutional provisions that may apply. There may be a provision restricting how an educational program is funded, different procedural mechanisms that you have to make sure you comply with. So you really want to make sure that an IJ attorney looks at your bill to make sure that everything checks out. In addition, choice opponents are trying to find loopholes in the Espinoza decision. We have 3 ongoing cases in New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont to make sure that courts are properly interpreting the Espinoza decision and to make sure that there are no ways around it. So things are still very busy in choice litigation. We're probably busier now than ever before.
That's great. And we'd like to reiterate, if you ever need any policy advice, especially related to how to craft great policy in your own state, IJ is your friend. But Jason, you are one of the nation's top policy experts, public policy development experts in the country, and we'd love to pick your brain on what opportunities that you're seeing in the states related to policy. What new things are on the horizon, or what things are kind of what opportunities are being renewed?
Certainly. I mean, as Erica said, this moves a large boulder that was on the path toward school choice out of the way, but you still have to walk down that path. So there is still a lot of work to be done in the state legislatures. It's just going to be a lot easier to do it. So I would say that Espinoza really has provided opportunities in 2 ways. One, removing this constitutional barrier. And although the case itself actually dealt with a tax credit scholarship program, the real issue that it dealt with is public funding, because the Montana State Supreme Court was the only state Supreme Court in the country that interpreted tax credits to be public funding. When that issue had been addressed in Arizona and Georgia and New Hampshire and a bunch of other state courts, and at the US Supreme Court, they all said these are not public funds. Your money does not become the government's money until it reaches the tax collector's hand. In Montana, they said these are public funds. And so the US Supreme Court treated it for purposes of the case that way. And so I would highly recommend that any policymakers who might be listening go to the Institute for Justice website. There's actually a report called the Guide to Designing Educational Choice Programs that they released in the wake of Espinoza that sort of, it really revises their constitutional outlook around the country. So there were a bunch of states around the country where IJ had said previously, you can't do a publicly funded program, and now the doors are open to a publicly funded program. And secondly, just from a messaging perspective, it's created a lot of clarity. I've already been in a ton of hearings this legislative session where the issue of constitutionality has come up, and it's essentially just swatted down. Actually, Erica did a great job yesterday in New Hampshire when those questions were raised. And Erica was there as the person who was on the team that won the Espinoza decision, saying, no, this is actually not an issue. And so it's taken it away, not only as an actual constitutional roadblock, but even in cases where there may have been uncertainty, a lot of that uncertainty is gone. So I expect we're going to pass a lot more school choice bills this year because of it.
That's great, and great clarification and identification of some new opportunities, or at least maybe some more open-minded eyes considering the new state of play. Catherine, would like to turn to you. You work with a lot of state-based organizations that really care a lot about education policy at the state level, and as we know, most of education policy is determined at the state level. What states do you see some real opportunity for the expansion of some of maybe the enactment or the expansion of some of these types of programs? And what kind of legislative activity are you beginning to see now that legislative sessions have kicked off officially in many states?
Yeah, it's it's good that you pointed out both the expansion and the enactment of programs, because I think we are expecting and anticipating we're going to see both this year, which is really exciting. Many of you probably follow school choice policy. If you follow school choice policy closely, know that a lot of times we're chipping away with these expansions to keep growing programs. I think we're going to see a slew of new programs this year, which is really exciting. Last February, before everything shut down, when we were anticipating IJ's case and Espinoza, we knew that oral arguments had wrapped up. We knew a decision would be coming down by June. We got together with folks at IJ and EdChoice and American Federation for Children and other colleagues who work in this space, and we put up a huge map of the U.S. and we said, where are we going to go, right? Because we know that a win in this case is going to be immense and enormous, but then we have to do the work to go out and actually get those policies passed once that boulder is removed. And a couple of places that we focused in on were Montana, which makes sense, of course, because where the case originated. Wanted to see a big expansion there and potentially add an ESA program into the mix. And Missouri is another one that we focused in on. The reason why Missouri was really compelling is that our friends at AFC shared some data that they had a lot of private school open seats. And so if we're able to enact a program in Missouri, families will benefit immediately, be able to take advantage of it immediately. Sometimes you pass these programs and you sort of have to wait for enough spaces to open up for students and families to take advantage. Missouri has a lot of space right now. So if we're successful there, something like, upwards of 20,000 students could be impacted pretty quickly. So we're definitely working in Missouri and Montana right now. Those are, very high on our list, and we're confident those are both places that were directly impacted by the Espinoza decision. But we're tracking 25 states right now where we think we might see some movement. Iowa is the furthest along right now. They've passed a school choice bill out of the Senate, and it's going to the House soon. Pennsylvania, we think we've got a shot at chipping away there, even with a Democratic governor. Nebraska has got a strong ESA bill, Arizona as well. There are so many, and in each place we're working with allies. State think tanks are involved in that, as well as allies from all local groups, national groups coming together to make this work. The one thing that we are being careful and thoughtful about is the funding situation. So a lot of state budgets have been impacted by COVID, and so we're having to really work closely with folks who have insights with lawmakers and the governor's office to figure out how we can push some of these programs forward that do have some fiscal impact. We want to make sure we're able to do that in a way that's wise and that we can get done politically. So that's something we're still in a lot of conversations about right now. It's an issue that's come up in a few places, but generally lawmakers are ready to do this. They're ready because of Espinoza. That's been cleared. They're ready because of the situation we've had the last 12 months in education. And we're incredibly bullish on being able to get some good school choice wins done this year.
Well, that's really optimistic and ties in nicely to the next topic. If the Espinoza decision, gave some wind to the sails of education choice advocates, the elephant in the room of COVID and the related, experience that parents and communities across the country are forced to deal with on still a daily basis. Some schools not having been open for nearly a full year, with predictions of not opening again until the fall. There are, in almost all cases, those are in public schools, both traditional and a lot of charter schools as well. The private sector seems to have weathered this storm pretty adeptly, and has been able to serve students. And then just good old American ingenuity has been able to figure out a lot of things too. People have approached pods, which we'll get to in a moment. They've been trying to put together their own school visions and that sort of thing. But COVID itself has really, forced, I think, some untraditional allies to be very open to parent empowerment and parent engagement related to education. Parents that normally would say, we live in this great school district that we moved here for, are now saying, they're not giving my kid the education I moved here for, and I need to be able to have the tools to do that for my family. So we've had these headwinds between the Espinoza decision and the way parents are responding in the wake of COVID. Catherine, let me stick with you for just a second. Can you talk to us a little bit about public opinion, how it has shifted as you've been tracking it, and what advocates might be doing right now to take advantage of these changes in public and public perception?
Sure, happy to. Frank Luntz did some great research and has put out a memo on this. So he's got it on his Twitter feed if you want to look for it. I'll see if we can post that here. But one of the things that he found, and I think is really important for all of us to keep in mind, is that 2/3 of parents right now say they would like us to rethink education. They do not want to go back. Only a third of parents are saying, yep, I want to go back to the way things were before COVID. So, and that's not just a health concern, that's the actual education that their children are receiving. So part of what has happened is parents have seen how things were going before. They've maybe been enlightened on how their child was doing academically. Maybe they were told by the school, your child's doing great. And they're realizing, as they had to do a lot of at-home instruction last spring and again this fall, that their child might be struggling. That has sort of pulled back the veil, and folks are realizing that maybe the education they thought was amazing isn't quite what they thought. And so they are saying, we want more, we expect more, and we want to rethink how we do this. We also know that 80% of parents would like ESAs. Now, that's the highest I've ever seen that number. We've been polling on this for at least 5 years, probably longer. I'm sure we've been doing it for longer, 5-6 years. And usually we're in the 60% range, sometimes 70% range. 80% is a significant jump. So that's the highest I've ever seen that. And I think that's very compelling. Parents are saying, empower us, give us the money and the resources so that we can figure out and decide what's best for our child. We're also hearing from parents, in some of the polling that I've seen, that they're spending a lot of time and a lot of their own money. ESAs and school choice programs, especially an ESA model, gives parents that resource back, right? Gives them money, gives them the opportunity to hire a tutor to help alleviate some of the time pressure that they're maybe feeling in doing at-home instruction. So what do we do about all this? I've just picked a couple of nuggets. There's a lot out there, and happy to take more questions on the public opinion polling side of things, because there's a lot of good data. But what are we doing about it as advocates of school choice? One is emphasizing the parent angle on this. And so that means doing what we've been doing for a long time, but really bringing it to the forefront in a way that people are listening even more right now. They know parents have been hit really hard by this. Students have been hit really hard by this. And so that's bringing out those stories. In a lot of the states that we're working in, we're partnering with local allies to help find and identify parents to testify, to record their story, to share it with lawmakers, to make that case. Putting that human face to these policies is so, so important. Just getting up there and talking about numbers and, and saying you should design it this way or that way. Yes, those conversations have to happen and they're really important. But from an advocacy side of things, and from actually, making the case and pulling lawmakers across the finish line to enact these policies, we've got to highlight the struggle parents are facing and the demand, what they want to get them to take action.
Thanks, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that EdChoice, the organization that Jason has been with for several years now, has been doing an amazing tracking poll related to many of these issues. So if you're not signed up for that, for their announcements, please do, and you'll be on top of public opinion related to this as well. But there are also lots of out there as well. Erica, it's great to think about new allies and new encouragement in the public and in the advocacy spaces. But we've all been big fans of IJ for 20 years now, and for a long time you've been kind of the only one of the only leaders in town related to litigation and proactive policy advice and that sort of thing. And as the movement has really become much more sophisticated throughout think tanks and policy organizations, they have taken your lead to help complement many of the efforts that you are doing, and to maybe even expand the space a bit, considering your pretty specific focus and lane historically. Can you talk a little bit about how you are working with allies in the litigation space to make sure that more ground is covered in the courts?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have been working with a few other nonprofit firms to litigate choice cases. For example, we're working side by side with the Beacon Center to protect the choice program in Tennessee. And we're working with ADF, the Alliance for Defending Freedom, to enforce Espinoza in Vermont's town tuitioning program, which is their version of a school choice program. And both organizations are really wonderful to work with, and we are very grateful that they're on board. ADF was also the firm that successfully litigated the Trinity Lutheran case. And even though that was not a school choice case, it was the case that paved the way for the Espinoza decision. So we are very grateful to them for that as well. I would note that if a firm does want to get involved in choice litigation, especially in a state that we're already working in, please let us know your plans and coordinate with us. That way we can make sure we're not pursuing conflicting strategy in the same state. But I'll say one thing I've been particularly impressed with over the last year is the work that some groups have been doing in kind of this non-traditional choice litigation, and that's all these school closure cases. We know that a lot of the public schools have been closed during COVID, but some states have closed down private schools as well, sometimes because the teachers unions don't want the private schools to be competing with the closed public schools, so they just close everybody. And there has been a lot of really good lawsuits challenging that. For instance, Will, the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty in Wisconsin, they're litigating a suit like that right now. And we have a lot of hope for it. So a lot of really good work going on.
That's great. And I'd like to just take a little privilege to say that something that Erica just touched on, which is, if there's an organization out there that wants to get into this space, reach out to IJ, make sure we're not duplicating efforts. I do think that is a role that philanthropy can help play, right? We are often asked to support efforts that complement one another and sometimes duplicate one another. So, I would just encourage folks who are out there to be mindful of connecting some of these partners who maybe from absolute no fault of their own, just really, can-do attitude, just don't realize that they could be complementing a space as opposed to duplicating it. So it's a good role for philanthropy from our vantage point as well. I've seen a few of the questions come in on the chat, and I'm definitely taking note of them. We'll get to those questions in just a minute. I wanted to ask Jason a follow-up question, though, related to allies defending educational choice in policy debates to help ensure the programs are well run. We've seen a resurgence of parent-led initiatives to make sure that these these programs are well supported and that the beneficiaries of these programs are the people who are actually benefiting from the programs, parents and students. Jason, can you talk to us a little bit about some of the efforts that have been happening out in Arizona that have been really helpful to your efforts there?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so in my adopted home state of Arizona, we've had educational choice for more than 2 decades. It was like 1997, Arizona adopts the first tax credit scholarship. 2011 is the 10-year anniversary of the first education savings account program. So the form of advocacy changes, I think, quite significantly once you actually have these programs in place. Once you've done all the work and finally passed the school choice program, now your work is actually just beginning, because you have to make sure that people know about it. You have to make sure that it's being well run. And so there are some great organizations that are parent founded and parent led. So I'll highlight 2 of them. There's one group run by Jenny Clark called Love Your School. You can find them at loveyourschool.org. Now, a couple years ago, this was in the midst of a huge debate over expanding Arizona's ESA program, the Empowerment Scholarship Account. This was on the front page of the news all the time. It even went to the ballot. There's just a ton of coverage. And yet when EdChoice did a survey asking families about why they were in, one of the things we asked them is, why are you in whatever you're in? If you're in a public school or a private school, or if you're using a program or not using a program. Families that said they were not using one of the school choice programs, we asked them why they weren't using it. 2/3 of families said they just didn't know it existed. Now, this is in the midst of all this debate, all this coverage. So we knew we really needed to do something big. And Jenny had just started this group. She has done phenomenal work at raising awareness about the program. Even during COVID, they had to cancel a whole bunch of their events. So they were driving around the state with like an ice cream truck, basically doing roadside events, give the kids ice cream, give the parents some information. And they tripled the number of applications to the ESA program this year over last year. So that's absolutely phenomenal work. And not only that, her group helps families, just sort of walks them through the process. And their website shows, here are all the public schools in your area. You can get to them with inter-district choice. Here are all the charter schools. And by the way, they don't charge tuition. A lot of families don't know that. Here are all the private schools. And if you want to access one of them, you've got tax credit scholarships and ESAs. ESAs can also be used for homeschooling and so on and so forth. The second thing is there's a group called Empowered Arizona Families. And they have been really working hard on the advocacy side. And a part of that is not just before the state legislature with bills, but actually going to the Department of Education to make sure that the programs are well run. When issues were coming up and families were really upset about things that the department was doing that was really not, let's say, user friendly, now they actually had a voice. And so these 2 types of organizations, parent information and parent advocacy, I think are going to be key to the success of the movement going forward.
And Jason, I'm going to squeeze in one more question that I think you're well positioned to answer from one of our attendees. She says that I love the idea of ESAs, but how does this affect the funding of a public school? Government can't afford to keep public schools open and fund each child for an ESA, can they?
That's a great question. So essentially how the ESAs work, the ones that have already been adopted, is that you cannot simultaneously have an ESA and be enrolled in a public school. And that means the district school or a charter school. So the ESA in most cases is using 90% of the state portion of public funding. So it doesn't affect the federal funding, it doesn't affect the local funding, but that state portion follows the child's. And then families can use it for a wide variety of options. They can use it for private school tuition, which is what most people spend it on, but also things like tutoring, textbooks, online learning, educational therapy, and you can even purchase individual classes. So let's say that you were doing some combination of homeschooling and tutoring, but you wanted to have access to, let's say, the AP chemistry class at your local public high school because they've got a great lab and a great program. Well, you're not enrolled as a full-time student there, so the state is not funding them, but you can take your ESA account and you can pay for that discrete class. So that's how that would work. And we find that actually there's been a number of studies on it, and these programs actually end up saving money.
That's great. And I would also note that especially as schools are not open and are not directly serving students to their greatest needs right now, that ESAs give a lot of flexibility for parents to figure out how to best serve their kids in a variety of ways as well. Thanks, Jason. I'm going to do one more quick round of questions for our panelists, and then we're going to get to some of the Q&A that is really starting to come in. So thanks for everyone to post questions, and just wanted to remind you that if you'd like to ask a question, just please put it in the Q&A chat box, and we'll get to it for sure, time permitting. The next conversation I want to talk about is about kind of next generation models. So we've been talking about ESAs for a long time in this space, and what they could look like, and how they could be really customizable. And in this year, we've really seen how that can work in real time. But then there's been collaborative efforts for parents getting together and creating what has been dubbed as pandemic pods or microschools, really small groups of students and families coming together to create their own schools that are being funded in lots of different innovative ways. And just wanted to take a minute to talk to the panelists about these kind of next generation models. Catherine, pandemic pods rose to prominence in this past year, of course, as we've been talking about, as families are looking for alternatives. How has this trend changed the education landscape, and what do you think it means for education options and school choice moving forward?
Thanks, Lori. It's changed it, I think, in a pretty dramatic way. And one of the things that I love about this reform and what's happening is the marketplace is working. Pods rose up because parents said, this isn't working for me. Policymakers, bureaucrats, you're not getting my kid back in school. You're not giving them what they need to learn. I'm going to take it into my own hands. I'm going to get together with a few other families. We're going to hire a teacher. We're going to hire a tutor. We're going to take turns teaching. However they decided to structure that. This pod model came to fruition because of something not working and because of parents taking that power into their own hands. And I think that's really exciting. It's something for all of us to learn, right? We can generate great ideas on the policy front, but this is one that came from the bottom up. There was no, think tank that came out and said, hey, parents, you should start pods. Parents pick this on their own. Now it's our job to figure out how to support and protect that. So at SPN, we think about it in two ways. One, we want to protect what is going on because what's happening is good, and it's good for kids, it's good for families. A lot of students are benefiting and accessing an education that they wouldn't have otherwise right now because of pods. And then the other thing we want to talk about is how we can protect them going forward so that potentially we see this reform become a permanent reform and something that's part of the education landscape and part of the myriad of options that families have when they're choosing how to best educate their children. So on the protection side of things and making sure we are giving families the ability to keep going with this pod model, we worked closely with Jonathan Butcher from the Heritage Foundation, who put together, and I will put this in the chat, a fantastic analysis of what's happening in all 50 states when it comes to regulation. What we started seeing and we got really nervous about this past fall, was bureaucrats and regulators coming in and trying to say, oh, you're operated as a daycare. We need to, you have to follow this health code violation, and we need to check your fire sprinklers in your home, and all sorts of crazy things, right, that are not relevant to families coming together to educate their children. So Jonathan did a fantastic job looking at what we were seeing across all 50 states. He actually flagged like the 10 most concerning states when it comes to regulation, and helped us put together some ideas around what we would need to do from a policy standpoint to protect pods going forward. So SPN then took that and worked with others to develop model legislation. And we're working in at least 10 states. I think there might be a handful more, but at least 10 states where we're customizing that model legislation and trying to move that forward. So far, I know Connecticut and North Dakota have introduced bills to protect. And then really quickly, the other piece of this is the making it permanent component, right? So the legislation will both protect what families are doing now, but set us up so that families can continue to pursue a pod model if they choose going forward. interesting stat from the public opinion polling, which is in the chat as well. 53% of parents say they are interested in pods for their kids. That's an amazing number. Half the country says, I might think about doing pods at some point in the future. That is enormous. If you ask Black and Hispanic families, it's even higher, 60%. So the demand for this is really high. We need to make sure that policy regulation doesn't get in the way of families being able to take advantage of this remarkable bottom-up reform.
Speaking of which, Erica, what are the ideal cases to challenge restrictions on microschools and pods? Because I know you guys at IJ are thinking about this pretty closely.
Yeah, first I want to say I agree with everything Catherine said 100%. And I'm very happy to see all this legislation being introduced to protect microschools and pandemic pods. Another way to protect them, of course, is litigation, is starting to sue people. And the way to do that is to find the right case. And we're thinking that probably the ideal case to bring would be a situation where you have a local government who is effectively completely banning pods and micro schools. As Catherine said, a lot of local governments, a lot of zoning boards are regulating them like home daycares. And that's a huge problem because in some towns, you're not allowed to have a home daycare, or you're allowed to have a daycare as long as there's only one other kid besides your own. So extremely restrictive. If there was a town that was applying those types of restrictions to microschools or a pod, that would be a great case. We'd be very interested in that. So if you hear about it, please give me a call or shoot me an email.
Those are great tips. And again, we'll say, be in close contact with IJ as you're approaching these policy developments. So Jason, we would think that in order to publicly fund some of these efforts, that our state would have to have an ESA or a private school choice program. Is that true? Or what other policy mechanisms could be used creatively to help publicly support some of these new opportunities that are emerging?
So I'd say it's certainly true that the ESA is probably the best way to do it, but it is not the only way to do it. If you have an education savings account, then you can purchase a wide variety of educational products and services. So that means if you are working with some other families to put together a pod and you wanted to hire an instructor, you could use your ESA funds for that. If you were going to be doing some online courses or a tutor or actually even karate classes to fulfill your phys ed requirement, you can do that sort of thing with an education savings account. So that's the greatest degree of freedom and flexibility to customize your child's education. But actually in Arizona, there's this relatively new organization started a few years ago called Prenda Microschools, and they have just really taken off. In just a couple years, they grew from 7 students to more than 4,000 students. And most of that was actually this year. Last year, when I spoke to them last January, they had about 1,000 students and they were looking to double in size, and they actually quadrupled. So, I mean, they're phenomenal. And most of the families are accessing them as a charter school. Now, some families are using their ESA to sign up. You could actually even use the tax credit scholarship, but they have partnered with an online charter school. And so if you sign up for the charter, then you can get access to Prenda. And all Prenda classrooms are between 5 and 10 students. And they have, it's not exactly, I wouldn't call it Montessori, but it's definitely a more student-centered, student-guided learning experience that has really been taking off, especially during the pandemic. So we haven't seen this quite yet in other states, but Prenda is already moving into a bunch of other states and looking at a variety of different options for families to access their services.
It's a really exciting model that we at the Walton Family Foundation have been really proud to support. And as we've been supporting many of these micro schools and new models as they've been in development, I'd encourage you, if you haven't seen yet, the work that we've been doing alongside Coke on the VELA Fund, which is helping people just start their own educational experiences in their home, in their own communities. I'm going to start taking a few, as we've been getting several questions and comments through the chat function. I wanted to go through a couple of them. One is building on the previous question about how ESAs will just in a policy sense could interact with 529s and other college savings accounts and scholarships. And Jason, I think that you'd be great to answer that question if you don't mind tackling it, please.
Yeah, that's a great question. First, I should note too, there's a lot of confusion around the term, which I didn't invent, and we're kind of stuck with it, although I'd really like to change it, because there are these other education savings accounts that are for college, like the 529 or Coverdell. They can interact. So one of the things about the K-12 ESAs is that any funding that you have left in the account at the end of the year, you can then roll over into subsequent years. And in some states, they've said you can even save it for college, right? So if you have some money left over after you've graduated from high school, you would have a limited number of years to use those funds for college before they would then revert into the state's account. Arizona originally designed the law so that you could put a certain amount of those funds into a college savings account, but for a variety of technical reasons, that provision was never implemented, and it's sort of been put on pause. But technically speaking, you could design an ESA in which, if you had leftover funds at the end of the year and you wanted to deposit those into a college savings account, then you could do so.
That is very helpful. And again, and I agree. Sometimes the college or the education savings accounts makes people think that they have to save their own money in these funds, which is of course not the case. These are funds that the government accounts that the government funds, right? Wanted to, Erica, maybe pick your brain on another question that we had from one of our participants. An effort is underway to place an ESA legislation on the November ballot in Colorado. With the understanding that you may not be familiar with Colorado law, if successful, would it be best for the funding to go to the State Board of Education or some other entity to avoid legal challenges based on any funding needing to go to a state education entity rather than a scholarship providing organization? And for context, Daniel's fund supports both IJ and A scholarships. So I'm assuming this question is coming from someone from the Daniel's fund.
Yeah, thank you for your support. I would not be able to answer that without looking into Colorado's law, but I have written down Dan Peters' number, and I'm going to give him a call right after this.
That it would be a different question as well, but we'll make sure that you get connected with this gentleman who has posted this question specifically, Erica.
Thank you.
Lots of activity out there. And then I have another one, and I think, Catherine, you'll be great to help us give context to this question. In areas where schools have remained closed, the pandemic has exposed how beholden school board members are to teachers' unions, even in America's most politically conservative cities, counties, and states. Have there been any successful efforts out there to educate voters and parents on how school board members impact the availability of not only in-person learning, but a district's willingness to approve and or work with high-quality charter options and private school models as partners rather than adversaries to traditional schools?
Great question, because so many people do not understand what their school board does and the power that they have. So I really appreciate the question. I haven't seen a lot. I haven't seen like specific campaigns to focus on that particular piece, right? Educating parents about sort of what school boards do and some of the tension here and the decisions about reopening or getting kids back in person. I do think, however, so I think there's an opportunity there. I think it's a great question and a wonderful idea. And I know one of our state think tanks, Independence Institute in Colorado, does a lot of work with like school board education and helping them figure out how to manage budgets and whatnot. And I'm definitely going to be picking their brain after this on the school board piece of it. On the teacher union side of it, I do think we are seeing especially right now, I'm sure everyone here has been reading the headlines, an immense heightening of awareness about the power that they hold over our schools and the power that they hold over the policy decisions impacting our schools. And I do think public opinion is starting to turn there in a way that is favorable for reformers and not favorable for teachers unions. One quick example on that. As many of you may know, Fairfax County gets a lot of attention, Fairfax School District, in national education headlines for many good reasons a lot of the time, but this past 12 months for a couple bad reasons. And the most recent of which is that the union has pushed very strongly to have teachers at the front of the line for the COVID vaccine. And now they're saying, great, giving us the vaccine, but we're not going to go back until all the kids have been vaccinated too. And as many of you know, most of the vaccines are not approved for anyone under 14 or 16. So that would mean shutting down for probably an entire another year. And in circles in Fairfax, parents are starting to say, wait a minute, like, what, really? And so we're starting to see that that shift and that awareness that they don't want their schools and their kids and their child's education to be beholden to the teachers union. So I think that's a big opportunity for us. I think we need to continue making parents aware of that and pushing that. It's an opportunity to educate. And I think we need to do more on the school board side front too, because a lot of people don't pay attention to their school board elections, and they don't think about the impact that it has. And I think we're certainly seeing that because a lot of decisions are being made at that local level. It's really important. So definitely something to look into more. I don't know if Jason or Erica have seen other examples of that. I haven't seen a specific campaigns, but I definitely agree about the opportunity there.
I certainly agree. I haven't seen that specific type of campaign, and it's not really our lane, but I will say that COVID, and especially the response to COVID by the district schools, has surfaced an issue that we in the education reform, and especially educational choice movement, have been talking about for a long time, which is that district schools are not directly accountable to parents. District schools are accountable to elected officials. They are accountable to unelected bureaucrats, but they're not directly accountable to families. We've seen this in issues with special ed and with bullying and a whole bunch of issues like that, where a family needs something for their child. And look, many cases, school districts, and especially the people who work them, that they bend over backwards to try to accommodate families. And most people that go into education do it because they love kids and they want to help. But just looking at a systemic issue and what the incentives are often not aligned for the schools to be particularly responsive. And so you've got a whole bunch of frustrated parents that say, my child has these special needs and you're just simply not addressing the issue. My child's been bullied, you're not addressing the issue. Well, now, instead of these being, cases of like, 2 to 5% or 10% of the population, you've got the entire system of schools in some states or in some areas that are shut down to in-person learning, and parents are pulling out their hair. We're seeing it in poll after poll where parents are extremely frustrated that the schools are not open for in-person instruction. And they're starting to learn, oh, wait a second, you are not directly accountable to me. I don't really have as much power in this situation as I thought I once did. And so the message that we've been giving to these families is that you need educational choice. Because if your school district is closed or they're doing something that you don't like or they're simply not meeting your needs, you have an immediate escape hatch and you can go somewhere else and find some education providers that are perfectly willing to meet your needs. And B, most families, they want to stay. They're in this school. They've chosen, they move to a town often because there's a public school that they want to send their kids to. They don't particularly want to leave. But if they have that option, and if the school district knows that they can leave and they can take their public education dollars with them, now the incentive structure has changed. Now there is the power dynamic has changed and the families are in the driver's seat. And there's a much stronger incentive in that case for the districts to be responsive to the family's needs. That, I think, is what a lot of families are waking up to and why we're starting to see such a groundswell of support for educational choice policies this year.
Yeah, I'll just add onto what Jason said, that there are so many studies showing that once you do have a choice program, it actually helps not just the kids that leave the public schools, but the kids that stay too, because of the changed incentives. So school choice helps everybody, and that is just so well documented now.
Agree. I'm also going to include in the chat function for everyone a a set of studies that the Center for Reinventing Public Education has recently compiled, and it's being refreshed nearly at least every week, if not more often. And this is just in regards to how districts are responding to these crises, and it includes some places where there have been partnerships between nonprofit entities, charter entities, private entities, and districts, where districts are wanting to figure out new ways to more personalize education for students who have been displaced. So just wanted to flag a lot of that research as well. Let me ask a quick question to our panelists, and anyone can take this one, but you've got a group of philanthropists who are, really interested in these topics and interested in making sure that all students have access to a great education. What advice do you have to the philanthropic sector, and beyond the obvious, dollars and cents? What other ways can philanthropy help your efforts? Catherine, let's start with you.
Sure. And I appreciate the question, because I think often we think of philanthropy as a financial investment, but there's so many other ways that that we can partner and work on these issues together. One of which I think is getting involved with local groups. If education and choice is an area that you're passionate about, there have already been, just in the chat, some great ideas coming out, things to think about. So getting involved with state think tanks, state-based organizations in your backyard that are working on these issues, finding out what they're doing, and not just from a donation side of things, right? But find out what they're doing to ask good questions, right? And to prompt new ideas and new action. That kind of collaboration can really lead to great things. I know we're fortunate at SPN to have some wonderful donors who have prompted me over the years to think about new ideas and new ways of looking at the policy equation, or how we can better help students and families. So your input matters and your thoughts matter a lot. And I think that's really important. And then on the, sort of the issue campaign side of things, like if a state is trying to advance school choice, you may have connections with lawmakers or, inroads into some of the leadership policymakers in your state who get to make these kinds of decisions about programs that get enacted or expanded. Using your voice in that way can be really powerful. We're often like pushing really hard to convince policymakers on these things. And sometimes you may have access to individuals or a platform that some of the advocacy groups and some of the think tanks and policy groups don't. So that would be another area where I would definitely, if you'd like to get more involved in this work, where I would be thinking and be looking to.
Jason and well, let's start with Jason, and then Erica, if you have anything to add. But we're getting closer to our time, so wanted to get one last quick question in from an attendee, and then we'll get to closing remarks. The quick question is a follow-up on something that Erica had alluded to, which is how school choice benefits everybody, and the research behind that. Jason, I know that you have been a part of some of this research and have followed it pretty closely. So if you don't mind chiming in, and Erica, quickly, if you have anything to add as well.
Yeah, just on the question of the studies, there is a report that EdChoice puts out almost on a yearly basis. It depends on how many studies there have actually been on over the course of the last year or two. But every year or two, we update it. It's called the 1, 2, 3s of school choice, and you can find that on our website, or maybe Caitlin or one of these people behind the scenes making sure that everything's running could find it. I don't want to mess around with my browser because who knows what will happen. But the 1, 2, 3s of school choice goes through all of the academic research on what's the effect on participating students, on what's the effect on their test scores, what's the effect on their attainment, so graduating high school, going off to college, what's the effect on the public school students that stay in their schools when a school choice program is introduced. And as Erica said, there's been about 30 studies on that question. Only one found a negative effect. All of the others found a positive effect, except for a couple that didn't find an effect at all. So, I mean, the evidence there is actually overwhelming that educational choice programs actually lead to improvements in the public school system. And we also look at things which tie into the other panels, civic knowledge and civic engagement. So you can find all of that research in our 1, 2, 3s report, which it looks like somebody has put in the, Caitlin, thank you very much, put in the chat.
And if there's a 1, 2, 3s, there's an ABCs as well, which is, if you want to know anything about any program in the country, look up the ABCs of school choice as well. Erica, did you have anything to add there?
I also added to the chat IJ's Myth and Reality document that also discusses those studies on page 11. I will add that a lot of times when we're thinking about school choice, we're always thinking like, what is the big thing I can do, right, to push this forward? And I would not underestimate the little things. I think that just calling your legislator and having your family members call and your friends call is going to have a bigger impact than you think. Sometimes we'll have like 500 kids show up at the state capitol, but if there's that one legislator who didn't hear from anybody in his district, he's not going to care about all those kids. He just cares about what his constituents want. So please, don't forget to do that very simple step of calling in or sending an email.
Yes, or are perceived to want or not want. Silence does say something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left. So everybody gets like 90 seconds to do a really quick whip around. 10 years ago, people will remember, close followers of school choice will remember that 2011 was the year of school choice. Everybody applauded it. There was a lot of momentum that year. But I think that this year may have the opportunity to kind of knock that landmark year out of the water. And I just want to know what is your predictions, fearless predictions in the courts, in legislatures, or even at home public opinion. Erica, what do you think is going to happen this year?
Oh gosh, you're really putting me on the spot. This stuff is so hard to predict, but I do agree with Catherine that we're going to see some programs pass this year. But I think the big thing that we're going to see is just a change over the next 10, 15 years, 20 years of just how people think of education. And a big part of that is going to be from the pandemic. So pandemic has done a lot of bad things, but this is going to be a good thing.
And Catherine, what do you think?
You'd call on me next. I hate predictions, but I'm going to be bold and make one anyway, just because I don't like to be wrong. Who likes to be wrong? But I'm going to go there anyway. I think we see 10 states pass something this year. A handful of those will be new programs. Maybe 30-40% of that I think will be new programs. And then I think you'll see expansion. And in the realm of public opinion, I think teacher union favorability, teacher union favorability. I'd say it drops anywhere from 5 to 10 points in the next few months. That's bold. I'm going bold because I'm hopeful. I can be at the beginning of the year.
You can. We have a reason to be optimistic. Jason, what do you think?
Yeah, so likewise, Yogi Berra said it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. But I think Catherine's not being bold enough. Now, I don't want to count my chickens before I hatch, but there's been a debate. There was a bet made between Greg Forster and Jay Matthews of the Washington Post more than a decade ago, where this Washington Post columnist said, basically, school choice is done. It's petered out. You're only going to, all the low-hanging fruit's been picked, and now it's over. And they made a bet that at least 10 legislative chambers would pass school choice. Now, not only did Greg Forster win, and by the way, it's pass meaning expand or adopt a new program. Not only did Forster win that bet, but he had 10 states actually sign into law those programs. And almost every single year since that has happened, that we've had at least 10 states pass either an expansion or a new program. So I think it's actually going to be more than 15 states this year. I also think that these are going to, by and large, be more ambitious projects than we have seen in the past. much greater eligibility, more ESAs rather than vouchers. Right now, there are 5 states, Arizona, Florida, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Tennessee that have ESAs. I think there's at least a 50% chance that we'll close the year with 10 states. So could be wrong. We could blow it in some states. It's happened before. But I think, if ever we've had a shot at expanding educational choice options, this is as good a ground as we've ever had. And I'm seeing legislators and parents around the country more excited to pass these programs than I've ever seen them before. We've got this obstacle of, the Blaine Amendment basically moved out of the way. I think we're going to see some really big things this year. And instead of the year of school choice, it's going to be the year of educational choice.
What a great panel. This has been honestly one of the best discussions about educational options that I've participated in quite some time, because there is so much reason to be optimistic. And just want to thank all of our guests here, Erica, Catherine, and Jason. Your personal commitment to this work, your organization's efforts and considerable contributions to these efforts over many years have really brought us to the opportunities we see today. We are grateful for your leadership and your effort and your tireless effort for bringing us to where we are. I hope that we are able to reconvene in person next year at this summit, and that even Jason's bold predictions are kind of blown out of the water. Because I'm pretty optimistic, both in the landscape of proactive legislative development, and in where IJ and many of our friends on the litigation front might take us in the lands of the courts as well. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Philanthropy Roundtable, and most of all, thanks for the audience who came and participated today. And good luck to everyone in the coming months. Stay safe and stay well.